morality and moral development. What is morality? How do we determine what is right versus what is wrong? How do we determine what is good and what is bad? There are many underlying structures of moral reasoning, and today I would like to talk to you about just a few of them. Moral identity is the way in which a person conceives of themselves morally. This is to say, am I the type of person who would steal a donut? Moral emotions are the way we feel about moral decisions. Would I be upset to witness someone else stealing a donut? Would I not care? Would I be shocked or disgusted? Moral intuitions are strong, underlying, quick moral beliefs. I may know that stealing is wrong, and for some reason, I may believe that stealing donuts is especially heinous. However, I might not know exactly why I hold these beliefs. Our moral judgment is the way we make decisions about what is right and what is wrong. I know that were I to steal a jelly donut, I may get arrested and spend time in jail, and therefore I would know that I must not steal a donut. Our moral reasoning is the way we think about moral issues. We may picture one figure with a pitchfork and horns telling us to steal a donut, while another figure with wings and a halo informs us that stealing is wrong and we shouldn't do it. Our moral motivation is the reason we behave morally when put in situations where moral decision-making must be employed. For instance, while stealing the donut, I may remember that my mother would be upset with me in this situation, and I would not want to disappoint my mother. So, I may put the donut back or return it to its rightful owner. These 6 facets of morality, intuitions, judgment, reasoning, motivation, identity, and emotions, form our conception of morality. The way in which this morality might change over our lifespan is called moral development. Though moral development has been a topic of interest since the 5th century BC, the scientific study of moral development began at the late 19th century with Frank Sharp. Sharp would create a moral dilemma, now known as the trolley problem, a particular favorite among moral psychologists and philosophers. In this scenario, you are watching helplessly as a trolley hurtles towards a group of 5 people tied to a train track. You are not fast enough to save these people, however, you do have access to a lever, and if you pull this lever, you will redirect the trolley onto a separate track to which only one person is tied. In order to assess an individual's moral judgment and decision-making, Sharp would ask them whether they would pull this lever and why. In psychology, Sigmund Freud became the first to study moral decision-making. In Freud's structural model of the mind, he conceived of 3 forces: the id, ego, and superego. In Freud's model, the id represents our most animalistic or base instincts, while our superego represents our most moral and correct instincts. The ego acts as a moderator between these 2 forces, compelling them to comply with one another for the best possible outcomes for us as an individual. In 1958, Lawrence Kohlberg, a student of notable developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, would develop a structured stage model of moral development. According to Kohlberg, an individual would progress along these specific 6 stages throughout their life. They were divided into the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stages. However, each individual phase of that stage would be given its own name and relative age range. In order to devise these stages, Kohlberg would have to ask something more complicated than a simple trolley problem question could tell him. Kohlberg would construct a set of 7 moral dilemmas. Among them were a number dealing with common, everyday situations that an individual might be put through. The ways in which they responded to these dilemmas would then inform where they were according to Kohlberg's moral developmental model. I would like to walk you through one of Kohlberg's most famous dilemmas now. In this situation, a fellow by the name of Heinz is upset. His wife is dying of a very rare, very specific illness, and her doctors have said that there's a new experimental drug that might save her life. And luckily, this drug has been discovered by a local chemist. Heinz approaches the chemist, asking, please, will she sell him some of the drug? The chemist, however, says that it will be 10 times the amount it costs to develop the drug. So, Heinz gathers the money he can, borrowing from friends and relatives, and unfortunately can only afford to pay half the cost of the medication. He explains to the chemist that his wife is dying and asks, is there a way he can have the drug cheaper or pay the rest of the money later? But this chemist is greedy and says that she is entitled to the fruits of her labor and that Heinz needs to find the money to save his wife. Finding this solution inadequate, Heinz decides to wait and break into the chemist's shop and simply steal the drug because he knows that he will not be able to raise the money to save his wife. In this situation, do you think Heinz acted morally? Kohlberg would ask individuals the same questions. Should Heinz have stolen the drug? Would it change anything if Heinz did not love his wife? What if the person dying was a stranger? Would that make any difference to whether or not Heinz acted correctly? And perhaps most tellingly, should the police arrest the chemist if the woman had died of her illness? Answers to these questions would allow Kohlberg to sort whether a participant was in the pre-conventional, post-conventional, or conventional stages of morality. And he organized these stages as such. In the pre-conventional stage of morality, which lasts from infancy till roughly preschool age, ending at about 6 for most individuals, the child behaves in such a way that they will not be punished, because they fear punishment. As they mature slightly, they will behave in a way where they see the best possible rewards for themselves. In the conventional phase of morality, a child will determine what is right by what their peers deem to be right, and select behaviors based on what is acceptable by their social group. And as an individual moves into their teenage years, and even into early adulthood, they will determine that right action is respecting authority and doing one's duty to society. The post-conventional stage of morality, which Kohlberg theorized that only 20% of adults would ever reach, dealt primarily with two principles. Earlier, in the post-conventional phase, one might come to the conclusion that they should act in a way that is for the positives of everyone in a society. Later, they may decide that there are certain universal, objective moral truths, and behaving in accordance with these truths, you might determine what is a right or a wrong action. Where Kohlberg sought to examine moral judgment and decision-making, modern moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt seeks to understand how people go about making moral decisions by understanding their deeper underlying moral intuitions. Haidt hypothesized that Kohlberg's work on moral judgment was not necessarily useful for determining how someone might act in a more day-to-day or mundane situation, and so he created an alternative hypothesis. Instead of being concerned with how an individual might formulate their moral judgment in a laboratory setting, Haidt hypothesized that there were underlying moral intuitions, which he came to call the moral foundations, which guided much of our day-to-day decision-making. While there is much empirical evidence in support of Haidt's theory, it is still too new to show much longitudinal evidence that would support that these intuitions do hold stable across the lifespan. However, this remains a promising new direction in moral psychology, and many individuals continue to work under the idea that these intuitions might help form our everyday decision-making process. Today we have talked about many things. The moral mechanisms, such as the moral identity, moral motivation, moral judgment, moral reasoning, moral intuitions, and moral emotion that help guide and inform our conception of morality. In addition, we have talked about the scientific study of morality and moral development, beginning with Frank Sharp's trolley problem, continuing into Freud's iceberg structured theory of the mind. We also talked about Lawrence Kohlberg, who created the first stage model of moral judgment development across the lifespan. His 3 stages of moral development include the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stages of morality. And now, looking forward, we've talked about Jonathan Haidt and how the moral foundations might help influence the ways in which moral psychologists continue to study moral development across the lifespan. I thank you all for joining me on today's journey and hope that you may ask yourself once a day, perhaps twice, what is morality? Am I a moral person? Should I be moral? And how can I behave more morally? Thank you. And please, don't steal any donuts.